From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Next is Stephanie Stillo, who is the curator of the Lessing J. Rosenwald Collection in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division of the Library of Congress. Prior to joining the Library of Congress, she served as the Mellon Professor of History and Digital Humanities at Washington and Lee University, where she taught classes on digital exhibition and design, public history, and digital storytelling. She's going to highlight some work at the Library of Congress that relates to collections as data in her talk, Only Once Imagined. Stephanie.
Thank you very much. And thank you for NDI for inviting me to speak today. I've been working with them on a digital scholarship working group recently, and I've really come to respect the depth of knowledge and commitment that they have to sharing the library's collections, which I think is certainly something that we see here today. And a special thank you also to Sarah for that lovely presentation. We were just commenting of how we were tearing up a little bit in the back. So. The title of my talk, I feel like, requires some explaining. Also, I realize that it might be a little bit risky to begin a talk with a poem that is called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. But nonetheless, here we go. So I am the Rosenwald curator here at the Library of Congress, and I have the great privilege of overseeing one of the largest Blake collections, William Blake collections, in the world. And I never get tired of saying that out loud. That's always a really fun statement to say at any point, really. So Blake, I think about Blake a lot. And Blake wrote this particular work immediately after the French Revolution. And the poem is very much this homage to the concept of change. To change in conventional morality, to change in politics, to change in religion. And it's a quite inspiring quote. So as a rare books curator, I think about Blake a lot. And I think about this idea, Blake's idea of the once imagined, quite a bit. And I usually think about it in the context of the way printing changed European society after 1455. And I like to think about what Europeans saw or what they were thinking when they saw the first image of the moon through a telescope, right? Or the first microscopic image of a feather or a blade of grass. And I think about how these visualizations empowered public knowledge and really upended traditional intellectual thought. So I think about history a lot, working in a rare books division. But what I find very inspiring about this moment in history, about our moment in history, is that the way that digital tools are allowing us to live in this age where the once imagined is true again. And through new data sets, through new methods of analysis, through new visualizations, we're able to ask questions that simply weren't possible before. And in a way, we're standing, I think, at this similar moment of change, which is quite exciting. So today I've been asked to talk about my experience at the Library of Congress. Now, I have to begin with somewhat of a confession. And my confession is that I work at the largest library in the world, and I'm not a librarian. And this is a reoccurring confession in my life. I've taught digital humanities, and I'm not a technologist. A lot of my research right now focuses on the impact of preservation technology on historical research, and I'm in no way a scientist. But what I am is a historian that has wandered into one of the greatest repositories of human experience ever amassed here at the Library of Congress. At over 160 million items here at the library, we are a galaxy of stories. And so today I want to talk about my methods of using these resources, But I think what's far more exciting is that my voice, I think, is part of this much larger choir of research that's really changing the way that we're thinking about our collections at the Library of Congress. So the first time I stepped into the library was not as the curator of the Rosenwald collection. It was back in 2012, and I was a Mellon Fellow. And at the time, I had this very simple goal. I wanted to tell a story about books. I was interested in how books moved through time and space. I was interested in the people who owned them and the way they used them and changed them for their own use. Books have certainly a sort of life of their own, and the early modern world, particularly in the Western world, people would annotate and color and draw in their books to be able to understand the information better. And I was terribly interested in this idea of attempts to organize knowledge, to use books in this very personal way, to classify the world around you, to make information personal. But one of the challenges of working with old books is that they often bear the scars of moving through time and space. Annotations fade, pigments corrode, books are rebound and resold. Many of them live through revolutions and political and religious censorship. They've crossed continents several times over. And this all adds to the story of your book, but it also adds another layer of research that's very difficult to access as just a historian, right? So I wanted to follow a book when I got here, but I needed a team of detectives, right? I couldn't do it alone. I needed someone to help me. And that's exactly what I found in the Preservation Research and Testing Division here at the Library of Congress. For those of you that do not work here, one of the most extraordinary resources that we have at the library are these subterranean labs in the Madison building that are just filled with this fabulous technology, much of it that I do not understand, and teams of scientists that are dedicated to looking at our collections as objects and digging in beyond just what we see under the surface. So when I arrived at the library, I met people that specialized in technology that I had never even heard of before. Again, I'm a historian, so things like multispectral imaging and X-ray fluorescence and microscopy don't exactly factor into my vocabulary. But these were the kinds of technologies, these forensic technologies, were exactly what I needed to get the results that I wanted from this project. And there was nowhere else that I was going to find this combination of resources and expertise, but at the Library of Congress. So ultimately, I had to learn, right? So eventually, I settled on this fabulous book, a World Atlas in the Rare Books Division. The printing was lovely, but the coloring in the book was sloppy. There were annotations. It was born in one place and ended up in another. It was problematic, and I've really come to appreciate, as a rare books curator, problematic books. They tell great stories, right? The books that look like crap are the ones you always bring them on. They're quite fantastic. So I settled on this book, and like most research, the conclusions of the project ended up being much more than I expected, and I don't want to burden this with too many specifics, but just very briefly. So the original print placed the beginning of my story with the son of a knife maker in 17th century Amsterdam in a print shop called the Three Crabs, which I think is a great name for a print shop. Analysis of the annotations revealed that my book moved to Italy with a student of military geography in the 18th century. And he likely bound the work and had significant annotations, so sort of revealing this interesting sort of organization of his geographic knowledge. The pigment analysis introduced me to a 19th century owner that touched up the colors, likely to fetch a better price on the antiquarian book market when he tried to sell the book, and eventually found its way actually into the collections of one of the library's greatest benefactors, and only into the library collection in 1980, right? So this was, again, there was a lot that in the end, of course I had more questions about my book, right? But this was a great story, and one that I've been able to talk about in terms of this journey quite often, which has really been lovely, and all emerges out of this early research at the Library of Congress. So now I have the great honor of being the curator of the Rosenwald collection, which is one of the greatest graphic arts collections in the world. And since I've become the curator, I've continued to work with our preservation division to think about unlocking new stories, right? Opening new doors for research. And I'm very lucky that we're able to do this. So just to give you a couple examples. Through multispectral imaging and principal component analysis, we were able to identify St. Catherine of Alexandria in this 15th century paste print. It's quite rare. There's not many of these that survive. But we're able to recover this image. Rightfully so, because St. Catherine is the patroness of librarians. So we had to make sure, you know, that we got her back. So we should all expect good fortune. We have in the Rosenwald collection, we have canceled plates from William Blake's America, so the first of his continental prophecies, right? And this plate has personal annotations, pencil annotations from William Blake, and they're fading. So through, again, multispectral imaging and principal component analysis, we're able to pull out these annotations, which are essential for the historical record for William Blake. Again, here's some more just. But one of the projects that I'm most proud of, which is a new partnership between the Rare Books Division and the Preservation Division, is a particular type of what you might call down market printing in the 15th century. These are called block books, block book printing. They, due to their sort of low status and ephemerality, they don't really last past the 15th century. The technique doesn't last really past the 15th century. They're somewhat lost in conversations about print in this really important 15th century moment. And it's unfortunate because these are really the prints that helped guide European devotion for nearly a century. So these new technical studies are really helping us think about new sites of production for these particular works through analysis of pigments, through analysis of ink, through analysis of paper, right? And we're able to get at these sort of wonderful resources in this new and fascinating way. So even with all of these new projects, and even with now being the Rosenwald curator, I still think about my one book, right? And I think about where it all began and why I was able to tell that story. And I think about that one story within the context of our 160 million items at the library, and each one of them having their own story. And a lot of our collections have been touched by names that we know, right? Names that we remember, names like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Rosa Parks, Hannah Arendt. One of my personal favorites, Carl Sagan. But I think what's most exciting and what's happening at the Library of Congress right now is that we're starting to discover, I think, the people that we rarely hear from in our collection, or we're just starting to hear from in our collections, and new stories that are coming or that are emerging from the library, from new partnerships and new research in our collections. So for example, the Chronicling America API, which is something I think that has already been brought up, but is helping us learn about American agriculture, right? Thinking about this sort of, what the organizers of this project call this long human history, right, of agriculture. And the way that Americans were swept into innovation and technology and science that has come to really define modernity. I've actually personally forwarded this to the historian at the Department of Agriculture, and he's just delighted by this project. So it was really satisfying to me. It was to be able to share this with someone. The availability of newspapers, and again, the Chronicling America API, is facilitating new conversations about American lynching, paying necessary and close attention to the victims of violent mobs, and exploring how newspapers played this dual role, right, between violence and reform, and thinking about that. We are just starting to learn about what will be revealed from the release of our 25 million MARC records. Benjamin Schmidt at Northeastern University is using the data to create a visual history of MARC cataloging at the library. If you haven't seen this, I encourage you to go look. It is quite fantastic, and has certainly the potential for insights into our own institutional history. I've been at many meetings now where this has been brought up, and I can assure you everyone at the Library of Congress has an opinion about this project, which is nice to see, right? That this is what these projects do, is they facilitate these sort of fabulous conversations, and it's nice to see it here, certainly at the library. So just to wrap up, again, I like to think about my experience at the library and my collection that I curate. Again, one collection within a galaxy of collections. And I like to think of it as this very small part of an emerging mosaic of research here at the library, where we continue to find those stories that are hidden in our collections. And whether that be an American farmer, or our own catalogers, or the son of a knife maker in Amsterdam, right, in the 16th century. And as we continue, I think, to explore our data, which again, we're at this really exciting moment where we're having a renaissance with our data, that we're starting to think together about the digital tools that might help us find these new stories. And we can only do that together, right? But what's so unique, I think, about this moment is going back to Blake's quote of the once only imagined, right? That we stand at that moment of change right now. And that as we keep working together, and as we keep discovering these collections, and as we keep making them more available, I feel like we come closer to truly saying that what we imagine today, we very well may be able to prove tomorrow. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.